Hi there, I'm Ian Robert Jones, and you're with me for ArtsBC's Facebook Live. And did you see that, by the way, Jerrold? We had a countdown. That's great. The ArtsBC Facebook Live is sponsored by the 2018 ArtsBC Conference. And this year's conference is taking place at the Nikkei Center in Burnaby. And it's all about engagement this year. And I've got Jerrold McGrath with me from Toronto. He's with Artscape Daniel's Launchpad. And we're going to talk to Jerrold in just a second. But basically, the conference theme is engagement in the new arts era. And Jerrold is an expert in engagement, and he's an expert in the arts. And he's here to tell us everything we need to know about engagement, what it is, what it means, why it's so important. Jerrold, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
It is awesome.
Well, I should say it's 6 p.m. here in Toronto on a Friday, so I just want to add that I think I'm committing a bit more into this than the viewers out in BC at this moment.
We are cutting into your nightlife, into your Friday night. I do apologize for that, but we appreciate it. Jerrold, why don't you start by telling us a bit about yourself? What's your background exactly?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a circuitous path, but I spent 5 or 6 years working in Japan as a relocation trainer, actually, and so prepping young leaders to be transferred overseas so that they could develop skills in the international market, then come back to Japan. Then I worked at the Banff Center for 8 years. I was the director of innovation and program partnerships there, and I was the director of creative ecology leadership. I left there about 2-3 years ago. Worked as an independent consultant within the arts field for 1.5 years or 2 years, and then about 4 months ago, I was hired on as a director of programs for Artscape Daniel's Launchpad. And I actually don't have it's interesting. My background is not explicitly in the arts. It's mostly around bringing people together to do new things. And so the opportunity at the Banff Center to work with not only with the arts community, but with Indigenous leaders, with oil and gas companies, with nonprofit sector organizations, with government, that was really where the practice and the work was formulated. And I just developed a passion working in the arts, and so that's sort of been my path since.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you said that, actually, because my boss would be thrilled for people to know that ArtsBC is not just building BC's arts community, we're building cultural leaders in lots of different sectors. And so you're quite right to point that out. So tell us a little bit then about what you do, or what Artscape Daniel's Launchpad is all about. I know that it's this amazing new initiative that it's not even open yet though, is it?
No, it's not. It's a hard hat tours right now.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about it. What is the project exactly? What does it consist of? Give us some details.
Yeah, so the project came out of a recognition that it's becoming increasingly difficult for creators to make a go of it in the city of Toronto and lots of different places. It's the work is gig based. There's periods of feast and periods of famine. And so there was a desire to start to address precarity amongst creators. Artscape Daniel's Launchpad is a 35,000 square foot space down by the waterfront that will have co-working spaces. We'll have 11 different maker spaces so that different creators will have access to the tools that they need to succeed. And then a really strong portfolio of industry partnerships so that industry can come in and connect with the creators that can help them to advance their own ambitions. And that's, not a requirement, but a lot of the creators we work with are interested in earning money from what they do. And so the industry partnerships have been, a key part of this. And Daniels is the partner in this and a very generous donor in allowing this to happen. But we also have gotten funding from federal, provincial, and other funders. And we're looking at November 1st, according to the newest updates, but we'll see how that all plays out. But we're looking at it, an open this year, and we're very excited to get in there. I've been in there a few times now, and it's when you go in, you sort of look around and you go, wow, we're actually doing this. The spaces and the resources and the other people in the building with us. It's going to be an amazing little community.
Yeah, and something you said to me before we were on air was that these people who are coming, and a lot of them don't see themselves as artists per se. They're thinking about themselves as entrepreneurs. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I actually think some of them are I wouldn't say they're hostile, but if we describe them as artists in programming, they actually kind of they're a bit resistant to having that term assigned to them. In some cases, I think it's, well, I mean, to be frank, I think many of them feel like they've been excluded from traditional art support service. They feel like they don't have access to these systems that are close to them. Many of our participants come from racialized communities or come from, they're newcomers to Canada or to Toronto. And so they're really looking for a way to understand the system that they're in, but also finding ways, and in many cases, new ways to succeed. And so I really love, like, I just did 2 programs over the last 2 weeks, and one just finished yesterday. And I just love working with these people, and many of them are, are younger, but not always. And they have a real hunger to find a way to turn their creative passion into a way of making a living. And even if they're painters or if they're working in ceramics, they still prefer to be referred to as creative entrepreneurs, which I find a really interesting distinction from the Banff Center, where for the most part getting your artist card was like the biggest accomplishment you could get. So it's been a leap.
That's interesting, because I was going to say to you, I wondered if artists are reluctant to embrace their sort of business side of their, the creative opportunity they have on the business side. But you're saying that this particular group, they're embracing it. They're less reluctant to worry about those distinctions. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think so. And I wonder, I mean, I don't know how much of it is a choice. Like, I think in many cases, they just don't feel like those opportunities are available to them through what has been described as the mainstream community. And so they're looking for opportunities to advance their craft and their practice, and by any means necessary, I guess. And so many of them are working across disciplines. They're often engaged with technologies that are new or just being introduced into into the arts and creators world. And so there really isn't a domain that's been set out for them. There isn't really a set of rules and expectations, and so they're looking for help in order to carve out their own. And we often argue with them. We say, mentorship is important, and you need to be guided through the system. But it's actually more important for them to figure out who their gang is, right? Like, who else is trying to address the same kinds of challenges and questions that you are, but are doing it in different ways, and how do you build relationships with them so that you can collectively succeed? Because a lot of these people are going to still be in the sector in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years. And so building these long-term relationships around, compassion, reciprocity, generosity will allow them to be collectively more resilient to the different changes that are happening.
And so who are some of the people we could expect to see at a place like this? Because you're saying that there's people going to be taking courses, then there's other people who are going to be just using it as a creator space, and are there memberships involved? Is it like do you get a diploma? How does it work?
Sure, yeah. So the space itself is membership based. There's different rates of membership. It's about $150 a month, which is quite reasonable for a co-working space. And that provides access to some of the tools. Other tools will require payment. So, for example, there'll be a textile studio, there'll be a carpentry shop, there'll be a jewelry shop. There'll be video and sound recording and post-production. And so use of those services will likely require an additional fee. And of course, some training, because we need to, you need to make sure that the equipment is being used appropriately. And then during this, there'll be programming that's delivered both in the space, but also to other, we're working across Southern Ontario. Obviously, I'm very happy to be coming out to BC in May. So the type of programming being offered isn't just limited to the space itself, but the programming is intended to scale out to different communities that are looking to build the capacity of their creators to succeed and to earn a living from what they do.
Right. And just a couple of quick words about what it is about this particular space that's unique or different, because we've heard a lot about hackathons and design thinking in the past. What makes what you guys are doing different to what those guys were doing?
Well, I mean, the proof will be in the pudding, I guess. But I think what's exciting about it is it's a completely interdisciplinary community. So we have creators from both nonprofit and for-profit tradition sharing space. And we're hoping to have 1,000, 1,500 members that are making use of the space in a regular basis. We also have the tools of production. And then we have industry there as well. So you're a creator. You have opportunities to be involved in training with people from very different traditions: photographers, videographers, I had a gentleman in my program recently who does marbling of leather and then makes very specialized, well, bondage gear. And so he met up with some photographers and videographers that have allowed him to sort of take his practice into new markets, into new social media channels. And this is just one program in one city. And then you have industry in there who are there to sort of catalyze some of these projects. So we have a partnership with Universal Music Canada. They may bring in one of their musical artists who wants to have some visual art attached to the work, wants to have some video work done of the artist, wants to get support around areas that they don't even know about. And so we can, in one space, bring these different factors together and actually do the production there as well, in a way that's, project to project to project, which I think is really exciting.
And so just a final word on that then. So if that's all true, how are you going to define success? What will that look like? When will you know that you're succeeding?
I think for me, success is when artists and creators are leaving the sector because they want to. I think it's a tragedy when people who are committed to creating beauty and wonder for other people are being forced from doing that work because of the lack of economic opportunities. Sometimes people may not have the right stuff to be able to succeed, and that's a different conversation. But when we're not creating the spaces and the facilities for people to even make an attempt at being successful at this, I mean, to me, that's a real regret. So for us, what we see success at is creators have the tools, the opportunities to build a career and to build a business out of what they're trying to do, and aren't having to work necessarily, in a restaurant. Nothing wrong with working in a restaurant, but if your passion is to be a musician or your passion is to be a visual artist, then there are opportunities for them to do that in a full-time way. Sure,
well, that's all good. So really, that's a platform for us to talk a lot more now about engagement, Jerrold. As you know, you're coming out here to talk to us about engagement at the Arts BC conference. Like I said, it's May 10th to 12th at the Nikkei Center in Burnaby. And we want you to go to the artsbc.org website to check out more information about that if you want to learn more about what's happening at the conference. But in general, Jerrold, there seems to be, when I'm online checking out what people are talking about engagement, there's a lot of different opinions. There's a lot of different definitions. There's a lot of different ideas. There's a lot of different ways of talking about it. And I was wondering if you could tell me about how you think about it and what your ideas about engagement are.
Yeah, sure. I can talk a little bit about this. And I think there are obviously very specialized applications. When we're talking about audience engagement, it's often a different conversation than engaging volunteers or community. But my work is really around a few things. One, that when we are working in the arts or even in the corporate realm or in a social realm in the environmental world, we need to be very clear about what the higher order problem we are trying to address is. The arts does so many amazing things for people. They allow us to make sense of the world around us. It allows us to make sense of the changes that are happening to us. It's a way of sharing stories. It's a way of sharing what we believe to be true about the world. It's a way of bringing beauty. It's a way of serving a need, a social need, a functional need. But all of those things need to be in service to a human problem or a human situation that needs to be addressed. And so for me, engagement is often around how do we tap into what that higher order concern is. And that then allows us to not only engage people where they are, but also allows us to engage other sectors, other disciplines, other resources in addressing that challenge. So very specifically, I'm thinking back to our last week of programming. We had a participant who is a photographer, and he understood his practice as being photography. But when we got into depth about what he was interested in, you discover that he grew up in Miami. He was a part of the Cuban diaspora, and much of his work has been around the issues of exile and people being forced from where they come to go somewhere else. And then the recognition that Toronto as a city is a city of exile. And so tapping into that higher order problem and conversation opened up all kinds of different opportunities, not only for creative expression, but also for tapping into resources, for tapping into audiences, for tapping into spaces that weren't necessarily in his line of sight. Now, of course, he still has to execute on that. He still has to go out there and do the work. But it opens up some possibilities that might not have been there before. The second thing, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and so the second thing that I'll be talking about, or the second thing I'll be addressing, is that so in the arts and in the creative sector, we've just developed this culture of instrumentality. We have systems that either by intention or not exploit people, and so what generally that isn't coming out of a place of malice. I think it's coming out of old habits, old ways of working that haven't been reflected upon. And so my argument is that when we want to engage people, we need to focus less on what we want out of them and more on how we want people to feel when they engage with us. And not just with our creative work, but with all aspects of what we do. And so the question we ask of people is, how do you want people to feel? And then how do you design the structures and systems within your organization that are most likely to support interactions that lead people to feel that way? And so it seems obvious and intuitive, but often in organizations we work the other way around. We say, what do we want people to do? And then how they feel about it becomes a consequence of our decisions. If we can turn it around and start with how they want them to feel, then we can be more experimental, we can be more generous in terms of creating the conditions for those feelings to be present. And this is like with donors, this is with sponsors, this is with board members, this is with staff, this is with audiences, this is with publics. Like it really is applicable in a wide variety of contexts, but it's not an obvious or intuitive way to go about doing this work.
No, that's really interesting. I haven't heard it talked about that way before. But just practically speaking, if you were one of those people you just described, a board member or a local arts organization or a community leader, what would you do practically? I think people would like to know, what do they hold workshops? Do they have information sessions? Do they hold events? What do they do to make you start thinking about spaces where you feel rather than what you do?
Sure. I mean, I can give a really like a very small scale example that happened to one of our participants recently. When you go in for a job interview, generally what happens is you walk into a room, you're confronted by a table. There are two people sitting behind the table waiting for you.
Yeah.
Your chair is open. All of the expectations are clear, right? They hold the power.
Yeah, it's very intimidating.
Yeah, it's very intimidating. So if you are committed to hiring, and if you're committed to drawing on the full cross section of the population in your hiring practices, and if you are committed to creating a work environment that empowers, that supports people to bring their best self forward, why would you create a context for an interview where people are going to feel small, they're going to feel diminished, and they're going to feel intimidated? And so this is a very simple thing, and it's just because we don't reflect on it, but it sets the precedent for that person's employment going forward. Who's sitting in those chairs? How are they greeted? What is the conversation that happens? If it's question and answer, if the expectation is I will sit, you will ask questions, or you and someone else will ask me questions, I will answer those questions, that sets the expectations for my employment going forward. I don't demonstrate agency. I don't have my own opinions. I wait to be asked a question before I answer it, and I'm looking for someone else for guidance. Now, this may not be what people take out of it, but that is generally how we respond to those types of situations. And so we can be intentional about redesigning that interview process so that that person feels like they're in a conversation, that their opinions matter, that it's not about evaluating whether or not I'm worthy to be present, but finding out what's special about me in that situation. And if that is the values of the organization that's interviewing, then why not have systems and structures that reflect those values?
I think that's well said. I completely agree with you. And if you want to learn more about that, I think your article in Quartz, where you talk about the different types of space and how people interact, is a really good resource if people want to follow that up. Do you just want to mention that quickly, Jerrold?
A while back, I mean, basically, I mentioned I lived in Japan for quite a few years. And so in Japan, space isn't understood in a mathematical way. It's not geometrical, it's not physical. It's understood as the experience of people in them. And so when I was in Japan, I noticed that talking about space, I often felt we weren't talking about the same thing. And I discovered that there are actually multiple concepts for space in Japan. to describe the dimensions of human experience in one. So like there's intimacy, like the feeling of connection to other people. There's the context, like the broader environment within which the space is situated. There's the knowledge that's mobilized, so the potential knowledge that's in a space, like that's like latent, this potential, and that's not just in people, but that's like in objects as well. And then there's this idea of this empty space that allows for people to come together and to discover each other in a place of quiet and almost emptiness. They use the ideogram or the kanji they use to describe it as the moon shining. Originally it was moon, it's now sun, shining through a window. And of course, the moon or the sun doesn't shine through the window all the time. You have to wait and be patient. And actually, it's not the opening that matters, right? It's what the opening allows that matters. And so that's a concept that I think would be very useful for more creative organizations to make use of, because we sort of cram everything in. And we don't often create room for breath and room for air to get in, which is absolutely necessary if you want to do creative work.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because what you're saying is change the way you think rather than what you do. And I think it's a great, if there's one thing people want to take away, that could be it. And so I would recommend going and read Jerrold's article. It's in Quartz. I forget the name of the title, actually. Do you remember?
Yes, actually. I think it's one of those, like, those teaser ones, like, you won't believe for the 4 different words. It's Western was it Japanese words for space? I think is the basic idea. But,
note to self. Know what Jerry's articles say before you speak to him.
Note to self. Know what one's own article is called. So I think that's a fair game.
So, is it safe to imagine or guess here, Jerrold, that this is what you're going to be talking about in your masterclass when you come out to us? May. Just want to pump the conference one more time. ArtsBC is having a conference 2018 between May 10th and 12th at Burnaby. But this is something, your masterclass is kind of the crown jewel of the whole thing. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what the masterclass offers is an opportunity not just to be exposed to some new ways of approaching design within organizations for engagement, but also to practice them. I think what's also very interesting is that people are actually doing really interesting things in their own particular realms, and we don't often recognize how exciting it is that the work that others are doing until we have a language to translate it from one sector to another. And so, in our classes, we have people coming from very different disciplines who have adapted in really interesting ways. But when they share what they're doing, people don't see how that might apply to them. So my hope is that in the masterclass, we can provide a language so that people can understand how people are creating spaces to cultivate better interactions with the stakeholders that matter to them. I'll also share a little bit about some of the more practical applications of it so that people can have a sense of how it can be meaningful for them. I mean, what's exciting for me is that to change how a system or structure operates actually doesn't require very much effort. Like, we assume it requires sort of a top-down action, but often it's quite the opposite. It actually just requires small changes in how the microtransactions feel. And so if you can change day in and day out how a particular interaction feels, you can actually change how the entire system operates very quickly. And when we're actually embedding our own values into those transactions, then we can actually build systems that reflect what we want to see in the world. And often we can do that for ourselves. So very quickly, with Launchpad, we've said that looking at creative entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial story that's out there is like the lone hero on his or her horse charging into battle. And that's bullshit. Like, most entrepreneurs rely heavily on other people. They rely on relationships. They rely on the compassion of others, and they offer compassion to others. And if you're in the arts, you're not doing it to get rich. If you're a creative entrepreneur, you're not doing it to get rich. And so to be successful, we argue, we need to develop a capacity for generosity. We need to be able to be available for others, but also be available to receive from others the support, the wisdom, the good intentions of the community we're in. And so what we're trying to do is ensure that every interaction around our programming, but also around the space, embodies this idea of generosity, so that it becomes a practice for the people that come through our programs, so that they can go out and then support others, and so on and so on. But to do that isn't just about preaching about generosity. It's about how do you actually institute that into the day-to-day routines of your work. And it's not just about giving, because I think the arts, they give. It's also about being open to receiving, and particularly receiving from sectors and disciplines outside of our line of sight.
Sure. And I know that you love to get people involved in the things that you're doing, Jerrold. So is is that going to be part of the process of the masterclass as well, to actually get hands-on, get people talking? I can't see you really doing it any other way.
No, we were chatting before, right? And this is an awkward format for me, because my preference is to get other people. I'm lazy, I think, is the lesson here. And so the key is to provide the minimal amount of sort of instruction and conceptual description, so that people can play around with it, and then offer feedback as we go. And so it's a real process of sort of providing a provocation, and then allowing people in community to start making sense of that, and then to feed that back, and then to have a response again. I'm a really big fan of sort of throwing something on the table, and then asking people to work with it. Because I think the other thing is that each and every one of us, like in the sector, there's this amazing ability to work in ambiguity. And so we need to give people the opportunities to work through the ambiguity of some of the ideas and concepts that are shared, because the applications are so varied.
Okay, that's awesome. I did ask you, you said to me, is it okay if we say anything controversial on the show? I'm going to give you the opportunity to say something controversial if you want. Could be edited, you never know.
I don't know if we'll see. I mean, the conversation thus far hasn't felt like it's opened up to it. I mean, I guess the reason for that is that I have some serious misgivings about how the non-for-profit arts world is organized in Canada. And I worry that some of the narratives and some of the structures that are in place, all they do is they serve to exacerbate the issues that we see. And we saw this. I did some work in dance, and dance is an amazing field. Dance is an amazing field, and we have systems and structures in dance that can often serve to exclude people from participation. And what's interesting is people in dance and the individuals in dance, they really, really believe in creating these inclusive and engaging spaces. The challenge is that we have systems and routines that don't. And so I think if there's anything controversial, it's to say that we need to reflect on some of the legacy structures and institutions that we're working within, because they may actually be working against the values that they profess to engage. And that isn't a product of people being malicious. I think it's actually just a product of not examining the routines that define how our work gets done.
All right, but that's great. It wasn't that controversial.
Oh, I know. I backed out. It's Friday. It's 6 o'clock. What am I going to say? But I will say the masterclass, there will definitely be more cursing. So that's the offer I will make. So.
I'm all for cursing. That's hilarious. So I'll leave it at that. I was going to say we want everybody each week to try and leave our audience and our listeners or our viewers with something that they can talk about or think about, and that's actually a really good place to leave it. I wanted to say, Jerrold, that I don't know if you know this, but ArtsBC at the conference is featuring a 2-hour panel session that's hosted by the Department of Canadian Heritage. And basically, it talks about the importance of creative hubs like Artspace, Daniels, Launchpad, and the work that you guys are doing. So thank you so much for being the first step in that conversation, Jerrold.
Well, thank you. And I actually would have a question for the folks that are there. I mean, I think what I'm interested in people bringing to the masterclass, at least, is an understanding of how they want the people that they work with and engage with daily to feel, and what they're actually doing to enable that. And so I think for me that's something that I try to bring into my work, but also into my personal life and into the relationships I have with other people. And so if there were a question to offer, that would be it. Like how are people helping people feel the way that people want them to?
Okay, well, that's awesome. Jerrold, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Just want to say thanks to everybody who sent in Facebook comments. People like Kathy Ramsey, Patricia Huntsman, Jacqueline Chamberlain, and the rest have been putting up the comments slowly, but we're still working out Facebook Live as we speak as well. And so even next week, I might even mention you. But we really appreciate you engaging with us. And Jeff, Jerrold, thanks again. Appreciate it a lot.
Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.
You take care.
Thanks.
Bye.